Is Caleb Williams a bust? Maybe. We're going to discuss it this time on Football Frenzy. Welcome to the Frenzy, everybody. The green screen is back. Iceman and Coach are back. As you can tell, I'm not in my normal digs here, but welcome to Football Frenzy, everybody. I'm the Iceman, Matt Frates. That is the coach, Brad Powell. Brad, good to see that face, and no green screen.
Iceman, yes, good to see you too, my friend. Pulling double duty tonight, right? You just hosted PF political football here before this.
Yes.
You've been doing the whole family thing, which is always difficult sometimes, but we had an exciting weekend of college football to talk about. Yes, we had the green screen there for a minute. I don't know what caused that, but we fixed it. Thank God for the intro video.
This has been a night of failures on an amateur level. So you're right. This is my second show of the night. First time I think I've ever done that, actually. I think the longest I've ever been on is a couple of hours for like the draft, or I think we did the Super Bowl a couple years ago, but we split it and we weren't on 2 times in a row. But I did host political football. We had audio issues, which of course is going to happen. And I said it then, I'll say it now. You see this, I'm in my father's basement up in Massachusetts. Normally I'm in my attic. We're fathers, we're everything. You know, it happens. It's going to happen. But we had a blast, so check that out if you haven't already checked it out. We did talk about this also in that show as well, but we talked about Caleb Williams. So normally we start with college football. We're more college football centric. We love the amateurism of it, or what used to be, at least I think the pageantry of college football. But Caleb Williams is an interesting thing because this past weekend, I unfortunately had the pleasure of watching the full game live without Red Zone. I had to watch that whole game. And the 2-win Patriots went in and made Caleb Williams look like he'd never played football before. The reason I want to start there is because it's kind of a local team for you. You've talked about trying to find a new team other than the Indianapolis Colts, and the Bears are a pretty poorly run organization. But I wanted to ask you, as somebody who was kind of excited about Caleb Williams coming in, how are you feeling right now? And that's not to say like he's a bust. It's just, how are you feeling right now?
Well, fortunately, I guess I'm not really emotionally tied to the Bears. I didn't think very highly of Caleb Williams last year. We talked about that here. I had some concerns, but some things that came out throughout the draft process, the pre-draft process, even out of him in preseason, started to change my perspective a little bit. And I really kind of liked some of the things that I was hearing. He seemed like he was embracing being a leader and a good teammate, and he seemed like he was putting, I don't know if I'd say put the ego aside, but he seemed like he was doing and saying all the right things, at least. And so that started to shift my perspective some. And he, unfortunately, like the last 8 Bears quarterbacks, he's the victim of a dysfunctional organization. I think that it's really hard at this point in time to call him a bust. I mean, let's look at Trevor Lawrence. Like I would say, even now, what are we on year 3, and the verdict's still kind of out, right? So I don't know if after year 4, right? So and the verdict's still out. No one's willing to like officially say, okay, he's a bust. He isn't. I mean, I think they're still on the fence a little bit. So with Caleb, after what's it been, 8-9 games, I think it's hard to make that assertion because of what's happening around him. They just fired his offensive coordinator. I think we talked on the last show about the crazy trend that has happened since like 2011 when I guess George McCaskey, whichever McCaskey now currently is the owner of the Bears. That's the grandson of George Halas, who's probably rolling over in his grave if he sees what's happening. My understanding though also is that, compared to other owners, the money is not at the level that it is maybe in some other organizations from ownership. And so they're not the type of franchise that's going to go out and buy the high dollar fancy coach. Like his name escapes me, but the offensive coordinator of the Lions is going to be a hot commodity this offseason. And it's likely the Bears, even if if they do fire Matt Eberflus, which they should, it's very unlikely that they're going to have the money or the willingness to write that check. And so they've got to find some stability at the head coach position, let's we'll just say at the head coach position because coordinators do turn over if they're successful. Head coach position, general manager position first, because until you do that, it's really hard to establish any consistency at the quarterback position. So I hesitate to blame Caleb at this point.
Here's what strikes me about the situation, and I did just talk about this a little bit. I let the other guys kind of get their shit in because it's their show. But when it comes to the situation, I think it's obvious when you watch this team play that they're not playing inspired football. And I believe that the teammates, I don't know how much they're playing for Caleb because you see him get knocked down, nobody's picking him up. The other team has to pick him up. That's pretty wild stuff. You don't usually see that in an NFL locker room, especially for a rookie. And so that kind of tells me that something is not right within that team personnel wise in terms of the personalities that they have. I don't know how Caleb is carrying himself. I mean, I think it seems like it might be a little bit different from the way that it was in the offseason. And certainly looking at the coaching, the offensive scheme is not doing him any favors, that's for sure. It certainly is not playing up to his strengths. He's holding the ball forever. I mean, 9 sacks against the Patriots. That's not a winning formula. No matter how you slice it, it's not a winning formula. And so when I look at Caleb, I think he needs to be doing some things to help himself, I think, but he's a rookie. Growing pains are going to happen. I think, though, overall, this is an organizational failure of the highest order. And I don't know, man. The Bears might not be an organization that can actually put it together because if you look at the last 10, 15 years of their existence, they've not been able to do it.
Yeah, it has not been good, and I don't know what's gonna happen. It's not gonna be a deal where they, I don't think you can expect them to sell the franchise anytime soon because it's such a family thing. It's a family business at this point in time. But I don't know how they get themselves out of this. They have to check their ego at the door, get their. I don't know that they're meddling so much, but they've got to get as far as roster moves and things like that. But they have to find a good football mind to put at the GM position, or maybe I don't know if they have a president, maybe they get a president in place or something like that. They need to put a few layers between themselves and the product on the field and fill those positions with smart football people and let them do their job and give them the resources to do it. And we've talked too about how, we forget sometimes that this is all business, right? And I guarantee you right now, the Bears are probably still selling a lot of tickets. And, and at the end of the day, that's ultimately what keeps you in business. Because fans, unfortunately, I mean, eventually, yeah, they'll show their displeasure by by stop going to games. But one thing, and there's our friend from the Pacific Northwest is here. Nice to see you.
I was going to say we should caveat that with he's a Washington fan, so USC is not really going to
Understood.
be the highest of highs. But saying here, Caleb Williams is horrible. He was all hype. And I think that there is something to be said about that because I think, Brad, you can agree that whenever we do draft analysis, specifically with quarterbacks, I think because quarterback's the most important position. It certainly is the position that, especially in the draft, teams are going to take higher risks on, a la Daniel Jones, Mitch Trubisky is another example, right, of the Bears messing up a quarterback. And I think a lot of times we don't take enough consideration into where a guy ends up, that a situation very much matters. And there's just tons of evidence that would show that that is the case. I mean, if you start switching a lot of these guys out from where they got drafted, I mean, if Tom Brady gets drafted by the Lions, selling insurance probably at the time that he would have gotten drafted, a lot of things change. And I think Caleb Williams was a lot of hype, but you were kind of on the board with what he was, what he was doing in college and thinking, I don't know. And his attitude in college you didn't like. And he's losing now. And are we seeing that Caleb again? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that you mentioned that he's holding on to the ball too long, and that was one of my big criticisms of him in college. Is I felt like he intentionally took plays off script, if you will, and wanted to ad lib and try to make the big play instead of playing within the system. Now, I guess partially in his defense, the system has not been great. The system that's around him, the pieces that are around him, not been great. He's got some tools at wide receiver, but you got to protect the quarterback. You got to be able to establish a running game, and there's all these things that go into it in the NFL. It's not just like in college football. They still play football at a high level, and all those guys on the field are really good. But there's only a certain percentage of those guys that go on to play in the NFL, and so you hear people all the time say, compared to the NFL, every wide receiver is open all the time. in college football, comparatively
Yes.
speaking. And so it's not kind of like one of those just like roll out the balls and let players play type of thing. In the NFL, I mean, the scheme and the timing, and there's so many things. I mean, it has to be perfect essentially. And when it comes to the other thing that I've seen that I think is hurting him, maybe even within the locker room, is his body language is really bad. I
Yes.
think, and that's
Yes.
one thing. I think that is like the kiss of death, and we talked about that a little bit on Braves Talk. You know, Bradley has a player on their team who's very talented, but he's got really bad body language, and it's just like the message that sends is it can be toxic. I think, truthfully, and it may not be intentional at all, but I think it's like it's one of the worst things that you could possibly deal with is having poor body language.
Yeah, I mean, the nonverbals matter a lot, and you can tell just by how he looks on the field. And that's why I say how his team is responding to him or lack thereof, I think is very telling. Now, the Bears have a chance to right this wrong. I mean, it's only halfway through his first season, so obviously they have some time. But I think that it's a very problematic situation with Chicago right now. And if you're the fans, that hopium early in the season having faded away this quickly, it sucks. And this is the hard part about being a fan. And as our Pacific Northwest friend, who, by the way, hasn't been in the feed, I think, all year with us this year. So it's nice to see you back. And it's almost been a year. He found us on Thanksgiving, and
Yeah.
here he is. And so he thinks that Geno Smith is still terrible. He's very, very consistent about that since last year. But how are we doing? It's a good question. I think we've had a good year. We have cut back a little bit on the content that we've been putting out, especially in the summertime. I would say, and Brad, you probably agree, 2024, probably one of our busiest years as friends.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it really has been. There's just been so much going on, and I think a lot of it is just what's going on in our personal lives, right? With the kids and
Yes.
everything else, family stuff, on all fronts, and so it's been extremely busy. But we always try to find a way to make time for this stuff, and it's nice seeing people that have been around, going back to last year, popping in.
Yeah, it is. And it's rewarding. And we've been building things slowly here. So the fact that we have a ride or die after all this time means a lot. So I want to talk about a couple other things with the NFL. Let's talk about the Dallas Cowboys. So the Dallas Cowboys looked awful. They took a massive crap on national television. And I believe that nobody is to blame for this but Jerry Jones. But I want to read a stat to you, my stat of the week. The Cowboys are the first team in NFL history to be down by 20 plus points at some point in 5 straight home games. And you're supposed to play better at home. Now, Dak is out for the season, but there's a lot happening in Dallas that I think is going to need to be rectified. And I think Mike McCarthy is one of those things. But the Cowboys, no longer America's team, in my opinion.
No, they're not. They stink, man, and they're they're one of those organizations, unfortunately for them, although Jerry probably embraces it, that there's a large segment of football fans that are reveling in their failures, because they're very polarizing. They're similar to Notre Dame, right? It's like you either love them or hate them. Very few people are kind of in between, and the Cowboys kind of portray that same persona. And you're right. It starts with Jerry Jones. It is all it's 100% his fault. He's a meddling owner. He's got a gigantic ego. I think he's a great businessman. I mean, he's literally. I mean, just look around, right? I mean, the guy's basically got a temple to football down there that he's built. But I think that until he's ready to kind of get out of the way, things are going to keep going this way, man. And you can't just pay two guys and expect that to fix your problems. You can't, it takes some, building a roster in the NFL takes strategy. You can have
Yes.
all the money in the world, but if you don't know how to spend it, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's no different than just people in day-to-day life, right? Yeah, sure, there's people that have low incomes, but if certain people manage money terribly, you could give them $1 million and in 6 months, they're going to be right back where they were before you gave them $1 million if they don't know how to spend it properly.
You just hit the nail on the head. Now, they're starting to see this in college a little bit with NIL and stuff, but for the most part, recruiting matters. Like how your words are used can get a guy to be there. Now, again, it's changing with the NIL, how much money you can pay. But if you're at these schools that have a large NIL collective, then you can kind of do both, right? You know that you have the money to be able to pay these guys. But in the NFL, it's all about the money. And we've seen so many guys go to a franchise for the big contract that doesn't fit what they actually provide, right? And that's what you're talking about is how do you spend the money? And it's not just the physical money, it's the draft capital. How do you build a team? Do you have the right pieces in place? But I do want to say this about the Dallas Cowboys, unrelated to what happened this past weekend. But the Dallas Cowboys, to me, are a brand. Now, every team is a brand, but the Dallas Cowboys are a brand above a lot of the other brands in sports. I think the Dallas Cowboys, in a lot of ways, transcend what a normal football team or normal sports team would be. I think you have the Yankees, the Dodgers, right? These are franchises, these are teams that their fan base extends all over the place. The Cowboys have had a winning pedigree a long time ago. And so when you have that winning pedigree, I think that there are expectations. And the Dallas Cowboys, in my opinion, for the last 30 years, for the most part, have not met the expectations of what that brand is all about. They should be better than this. And I said this about Jason Garrett as well. This is the Dallas Cowboys, that it should be considered the best job in the entire NFL. And for Jerry Jones to give it to Jason Garrett, who had very little success in what is compared to Jimmy Johnson's era, to give him that job for a decade is inexcusable. For Mike McCarthy to have his job, yes, winning a lot of regular season games, but consistent failure in the playoffs when it matters. This is why the Cowboys are where they are, because the brand is not being lived up to by the man who created the brand, really, Jerry Jones. And he is solely responsible because he's not just the owner, he's the GM. And when you do both, you get all the heat for it. And that's my problem, is that Jerry Jones doesn't want to face the music. He says things like, we can't afford it. Well, then you shouldn't have told your fan base, we're all in, when you knew that you couldn't be all in. And I think it solely falls on Jerry. Yes, the players have something to do with it, the coaching, all that. But Jerry has created this culture and continued with it. And he is the sole reason, in my opinion, why they are where they are and why their brand is no longer what it was. And I stand by that.
Well, I don't know if you've heard the solution that's being thrown about out in the sports media world.
You're going to say Bill Belichick, aren't you?
No, no, sir.
Oh.
No, sir.
Deion Sanders.
There's a path here. Okay.
A
It's
pathway.
The Cowboys tank the rest of the season. I mean, they may not even have to try to be the worst team.
No, they won't.
But anyways, let's just say they tank the rest of the season and they get the first overall pick. They draft Shador, they hire Dion, and then they pull a Eli Manning to try to get Travis Hunter. That's the path to success for the Cowboys. Now, there's one reason why I think something like that could work for them, truthfully, and that is because I think Deion Sanders is like the type of person that could push back against Jerry Jones.
Do you
That
think
Jerry might listen to if Deion's like, hey, just go sit down, old man. Like, I mean, he wouldn't say that. I think he probably has the highest respect for Jerry Jones, but I think that he would. I think he could push back to a little more and maybe have a little more influence than Mike McCarthy has been able to have for sure. He wouldn't be a yes man, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
This is two divergent concepts because Jerry really doesn't do well with pushback, although I think that he could take a step back. And would this work? I don't know. See, this is where Deion Sanders, I worry that he is able to do what he can do because he brings to college kids this pedigree of obviously being able to do the job. When you get to the pros, it's so much harder. But Deion has at least done it at the highest level. He's a Hall of Famer, but that doesn't always buy you anything. And it's a matter of, can he motivate professionals? Can he motivate grown men to do this job? I don't know. There is a pathway to this, but I don't know if it's the right pathway. I mean, there's no real
It'd be entertaining
good solution. It would, but that's the thing, right? Is like entertaining is awesome for us, but Jerry Jones, entertaining is not the currency he wants to be traveling in. It's wins and Super Bowl wins, and he still is trying to dip into this like Scrooge McDuck, this currency from 30 years ago. It just doesn't work. So fascinating stuff happening in the NFL. We could talk about that forever. I know we don't talk about as much NFL, so we wanted to lead off with it. But honestly, our bread and butter is college football, and so we are going to get to it. So the other night on Tuesday, they came out with the second college football rankings. So here you go. Another graphic that I stole. It looks really good in my opinion. So this is fascinating. Now we're going to get to the playoff bracket or the projected bracket in a minute, but I think some things that stand out for me below the 14 line, Obviously, you have Colorado at 17. We already talked about Coach Prime and the boys. They've been looking really good. Your pick of the week took another dump again, but we
Of
actually like
course.
that because Colorado looking good. Number 18, Washington State. Fascinating to watch because they can't get an auto bid, so they're going to have to keep winning. But what happens? Committee could have a really interesting choice to make a little bit later on. I like seeing Clemson and South Carolina right next to each other. Shane Beamer got the boys rolling. And then, of course, Army at number 24. But that's not really why we're here. It's this playoff bracket. So let's take a look at this right now. What stands out to you?
Well, what stands out to me is there's going to be a gigantic disparity, obviously, when you look at you got to take. I've seen a lot of confusion by people not being able to wrap their heads around the top four seeded teams and then the overall rankings comparatively, and then how teams end up certain places. And I've tried to simplify it as much as I can and say, all right, this is what you do when you look at the rankings. They put out the rankings, look at the four highest ranked conference champs, remove them from the list, and then start counting at five.
Yep.
And that's what you got to do, and then that's where it makes sense. That's why when you see the certain rankings next to the seed, it's like, well, they're seeded, like Miami, they're seeded fourth, but they're the ninth ranked team. It's the whole conference champ thing. I think, honestly, what sticks out to me, and I don't want to jump ahead too much, I do want to talk about this, but what sticks out to me is I would not be shocked to see a revamp of this quickly because of to revamp the conference champ auto buy situation. Um, because you're gonna have likely, um, like, look at this, Ohio State at the 5 seed. That is the best draw in the whole damn thing,
Sure.
okay? I mean, and
Absolutely.
not saying that if they were seeded second, it would be necessarily that much worse, but, yeah, sure, they don't get a bye, but they're gonna play what's gonna be the 12 seed, which may not be Boise State, truthfully.
Mm-hmm.
Boise State could move up, and then right into Miami, who's the 4 seed, who's, ranked ninth technically. I mean, so yeah, then you're going to get the one in the semis, but by then you're rolling, hopefully, and you got a good thing going. I think that you're going to see a couple really, really good football teams get left on the outside. That's what sticks out to me too.
Yeah, I think this is not perfect. I mean, it's a start, but it's certainly not perfect. When I look at this, I see obviously Ohio State at 5, which is where they have been. It's strange to think of them on the outside of the buys because they are the number 2 team in the country. The committee obviously still really likes them. The committee still really likes Texas. And the Texas game or the Texas team at this point is the epitome of the eye test. I think that the ceiling is what is selling the committee on Texas. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it seems like it because if you look at their schedule and the wins that they have, not many of them have aged well, if at all. I think Vanderbilt is their best win, and even that, not that great. I look at Penn State, who I think is in the driver's seat in terms of just keep winning now, and they'll probably be in if they keep winning. Indiana finally takes a bump up, which I appreciate, but they're still on shaky ground to me because even though they're 5, I feel like a loss. A lot of people say they don't have a good win. And it's like the criteria for why teams are in seems so strange and across the board. Like I get why Ole Miss is in. They beat Georgia, sure. I get why Alabama's in. They keep on winning and teams like that. But this is not a perfect system. And to your point, the auto bid, if they get rid of conference champions being auto bids, I feel like it's a step in the direction of why do the conferences even matter? You know what I mean?
Well, I think you can keep it as an auto bid, but I think that maybe you'll see them move away from it being a buy, and that the true four highest ranked teams would get the buys. I know they want to incentivize winning a conference championship, but I do think that there's still some incentive there. I mean, because it's a path for a team that maybe would be on the outside otherwise. Um, and that's what I heard a scenario today. I mean, while unlikely, it is possible that West Virginia could theoretically find themselves in the Big 12 title game. You
Yep.
know what I mean? And so you could have essentially a 500 team, possibly unlikely, end up in the playoff, which is fine. That's exciting, right? It's like that's what we like about March Madness. But I I think now in that scenario, they would not get a bye because they would not be ranked higher than Boise State in that case. So that would bump Boise State into the top 4, assuming they're still, where they are. And they'd end up at the 12 seed. But I don't know, man. It seems so strange to see these teams with buys, especially when we know what the strength of the ACC in the Big 12 are this year compared to the Big 10 and SEC, especially the SEC. It's just bizarre. And I mean, and again, it's a one off. I don't know that you make a big change off one season, but, um, and you mentioned the things that the committee seems to be having their eyes on. To me, I think they're just looking almost strictly at record, man. They're just like record and like the most recent head to heads.
Maybe. But why is
And
Army so far away from this then?
that's true. That's a good point. But, or yeah, or why is Indiana technically, ranked fifth?
Yes.
Why aren't they
Not that I
higher?
think that
Like, we
Army
talked
should be
about it.
in, by the way. It's not that I'm
Yeah,
advocating, but to your point, if they're looking at record, Army should be closer. Like they just should be
right.
closer. Now, you and I would take probably almost every team on this list over Army on a neutral field, which I think is part of what, the criteria
Sure.
could be. But I just, again, I have railed against the committee for years because I feel as if the transparency is not there. And in a 12
Agreed.
team playoff, you have the ability to be a little bit more transparent. And I feel like we're not getting it yet. And maybe it's just because there's growing pains to, hey, the committee's having to pick 12 teams now. So, okay, fine. I'll give that to you. What I don't want is an overcorrection in year two, just like you said. I do not want there to be something drastic. I think it's hey, this is the first time. Let's make some tweaks to maybe the criteria. Or again, show us. Do like they do for the selection Sunday for March Madness. Show us resume. Show us good losses, bad losses, how they kind of rank out. Like maybe we need another ranking similar to how they have. What did it used to be? Is it the net? Is that what it's called now in college basketball?
Yeah,
Whatever it used
yeah.
to be. RPI is what it used to be, or something like
Yeah,
that.
now it's the net.
Yeah, so where you can kind of look and get an idea based off of a whole bunch of criteria how a team is. And yes, maybe that comes closer to the BCS, but we're not using the computer to make these decisions. It's just an input.
Just a tool, yeah.
Yes. And so I think there will be tweaks to this, but I'm not look, here's the thing, right? I'm not upset about this bracket. There's a lot of people who are upset about how these teams are ranked and so forth. And I told you last week, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
It will be what it will be because a lot of teams are going to play each other. Teams are going to lose and so forth. And we will be where we'll be at the end. Maybe there'll be a controversial pick. Who knows? But I think overall, the cream will rise to the top and we'll get what we get. And at the end of the day, I think the national champion will be a team that you and I probably can look in the mirror and say, that's a national champion.
No, I think so too. And there's going to be people pissed. And we talked about that. We said, because even with the 14 playoff, the number 5 team was always pissed. I'm like, they go to 12, the number 13 team is going to be pissed. They could go to 16, the 17 team is going to be pissed. There's always going to be somebody that's mad that they were just on the outside. And to be able to look at teams that made it and find different criteria they think that they performed better in. But I do agree that some of this is puzzling, but so much of it's going to change between now and December because several of these teams play each other. There's obviously the potential for upsets along the way that could completely shuffle this thing, to a crazy degree. Who knows? I mean, Indiana could knock off Ohio State. What happens then?
I hope.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. I mean, it's good for that kind of shit's good for college football. Honestly, I love seeing it. Now I want to make an argument.
Yes.
An objective argument. So looking at this today, so let's say that Georgia wins out, let's say they don't play in the SEC championship game, right? And they're currently sitting at 2 losses, right? Georgia?
Yes.
Okay. Georgia has the number 1 ranked strength of schedule in the country.
Yes.
All right. I objectively looking at this completely understand how someone could be incredibly pissed, and I would tend to almost agree that you're going to leave out a 10-2 Georgia with the number 1 strength of schedule in favor of an 11-1 Notre Dame with like a number 7, like a 75th ranked strength of schedule.
Yes.
And
I can
I'm
see that too.
saying that as a Notre Dame fan. And I understand like Notre Dame's they've been doing what they've had to do. They've been winning by large margins against mostly inferior opponents. And I hope they get in and everything else, and they likely will. And, hopefully then they can get a chance to get a signature win or two and maybe quiet some of the doubters and this and that. But as far as like resume, side by side resume, I don't know how someone could like make an unbiased argument in favor of Notre Dame over, we'll just say Georgia at this point because they're the first team out. When you compare resumes, I mean they've got to win over Texas at Texas, the number three ranked team in the country. I mean, that's a really good win. Notre Dame's best win to date is at Texas A&M, which was a great win, but it was also in the first week of the season, followed by a loss at home to Northern Illinois, who's a middle of the pack MAC team. And again, like I said, they've taken care of business since then. They've had a couple okay wins in Louisville, and Navy, and hopefully, Virginia's been okay, so that'll be an okay win. Hopefully, a chance to beat an undefeated Army. But we've seen what the committee thinks of Army. They're at 24, so it's not like that's not really a needle moving win.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit, and this goes to the criteria that I was talking to you about before, is resume. So one of the things that I think hurts this ranking this year is the fact that the Big 12 and the ACC are so mid across the board. I mean, there are good teams, but they're not really any national championship contenders. So when you think about it, all of these conferences that are involved here, there's only two that really matter: the Big 10 and the SEC, which is not surprising. But the SEC has been dog eat dog, as I think one of our viewers had said a couple of weeks ago. And because of that, you now have a muddled SEC picture where a Texas kind of gets the nod because they only have one loss. But that loss, to your point, was to a Georgia team that honestly, since that win, has been trending downward. Like, they
Right.
haven't really looked good. Carson Beck looks terrible, like terrible. And so this may not even be an argument. And so this is all hurt because you have Miami, who really isn't a national championship contender, I don't think. They're there de facto because the ACC is so bad. BYU, kind of the same thing. Yes, they're undefeated, but do we feel like they're a national championship contender? Probably not. And so that leaves you with only a handful of teams. And many of the teams that we think can win a national championship aren't even in play for a conference title. So this is going to come down to transparency. It's going to come down to criteria. I want to see why an 11-1 Notre Dame team would get in over a 10-2 Georgia team. That's assuming that Georgia trends back upward. Does Notre Dame look better in their games? Because sometimes with this, recency bias does come in, and I think it does kind of matter because let's say Notre Dame looks really good. Let's say they crush every team that they play from now on. That's a good-looking football team. And it would be the antithesis of Florida State last year, who, losing their quarterback, didn't look the same. You know what I mean? And so
Right.
this is all going to be subjective. There are certain things. If Oregon wins the Big 12 title game, a Big 10 title game, they're in. But I want to ask you a question because I think it's going through my mind. Does this playoff model, the way that it's constructed with some of the flaws that we've pointed out, does it make the conference title game kind of not good for this model because you do possibly incite a little too much chaos?
Well, okay, let's admit one thing real quick. The conference championship game at this point is purely a money grab.
Yes,
There's
we
really
know this.
no reason to play the game, other than the money grab. And yes, it does provide a path for a Cinderella, if you will. And if that's what we're gonna refer to as inciting chaos, then yeah, I would say this model certainly favors that. Um, no doubt about that. But again, like, we talk about chaos, like how exciting would it be to see Colorado win the Big 12 and be in the playoff? I mean, how incredibly exciting would that be? I'm sure there's people to be super pissed about it, especially if you're Georgia sitting at home and you're watching, Coach Prime and the boys in the quarterfinals of the college football playoff. But they would have earned their way there
Sure.
within the system as it is. But um I do think there's situations where like a Penn State. So let's say that let's say Ohio State and Oregon play in the Big Ten title game. So that would be twice they've played, and then
Yes.
they could play again just a few weeks later in the semifinals, theoretically, right? Or even sooner, depending on how the seedings shake out. And so, is it really great to like play a team 3 times? Like, I mean, just imagine if it was Michigan instead, where they played them the last game of the year, played them in the conference championship game, and then maybe played them 2 weeks later. I mean, just like boom, boom, boom. And I know we see that a little and occasionally in the NFL, that kind of thing. But, I do you need to see Ohio State and Oregon play in the Big Ten championship to know like who should? I mean, really, they're just playing for the bye at that point. Both teams are going to be in, assuming that they don't lose any other games between now and then. And so I don't know, man. Like it would be interesting to see if it makes conferences change their criteria of how they make it to the conference title game.
Yeah. And that's so when I think about this, let's say Oregon runs the table. I think they should be in. Regardless, like they're considered a conference champion, regular season conference champion. Like maybe we need to start doing that. And then I think there are situations where there's not a clear-cut idea and maybe you need a championship game that sort of defines where this goes. I think there could still be a game, there could still be money to be had. But let's take the Big 12 where there's one undefeated team. And if BYU goes undefeated, beats everybody they're supposed to be in their conference, like why shouldn't they be awarded the conference? You know what I mean? And be given that. And then these conference title games could almost be like play-ins to the playoff, to where these teams that are on the fringe, right? You got a one loss, or one loss Colorado in the Big 12 in terms of conference, something like that. I'm sure there are things that could be done, but this playoff model, it seems like it benefits certain teams more than it benefits others. And I don't think that it's inherent to the system. I think this year might be an outlier. I don't know. But like you said, Ohio State, if they win out, even if they don't win the Big Ten championship, like, do they still get in? Does a 2-loss Ohio State team get in if their only 2 losses are to Oregon?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's obvious by their number 2 ranking what the committee
Yeah.
thinks of them. I think
Yes.
there's a lot of people that are really, really high on them. I'm not as high on them as like all the pundits and everyone else. I think they're really talented. I just think that they don't, because of their coaching, they don't maximize their talent. But what we're seeing though is a byproduct of these super conferences because they're you're not able to play everyone in your conference now. You theoretically you may be playing maybe half the teams in your conference, and depending on your schedule shakes out. Like Indiana has benefited from a fairly easy schedule thus far. Now
They
they've
have.
gone out and just beat the shit out of everybody, which is great. But yet they have Ohio State, but they've dodged Oregon, they've dodged uh, Penn State, so like they have not had an incredibly difficult path to where they are now. And they're going to be the benefactor of that most likely. And I think there's probably, if we looked around, I'm sure there's some others as well. I'm sure that there's someone in the SEC that's got a really favorable schedule. Penn State, yeah, I don't think Penn State played. Didn't they go
Penn,
play Oregon?
no, they
No, or
played.
was it Washington? No,
No, they played.
I
No,
thought they
they
went out
no, they
west.
did
Oh,
not. Because
USC. USC is when they went out west, right?
yes, they went out west, and that was a game where you said they were exposed, and then they came back and won. And
Yeah.
so, which of course, kiss of death. I don't know. I'm not looking at this and complaining because honestly, I feel like these rankings come out. Like last night, I was watching them live, and I'm thinking it's gonna be a great show because there's a lot to look at here, and there's a lot to say. I mean, we haven't even talked about Ole Miss jumping up because they got a big win over said Georgia team. And so you got teams that are jumping in with 2 losses already because they're making big moves. And what I also see here is that the committee really, really, really likes the Big Ten.
Yeah, I think so. Well, what are we looking at?
4 out of
4
top 5
teams?
teams.
Well,
Yeah.
and you're the same way with the SEC's 4 also. And I think there's a possibility that you see it's not out of the realm of possibility you see 5 SEC teams in the playoff. And now this is the scary part though. So let's say that Georgia finds a way in without any other SEC team falling out. The scary part is I think any of those 5 teams could win the national championship.
Yeah.
That's what's scary. I don't think I could say that about the Big Ten. I don't think that Penn State can win the national championship. I don't think that Indiana can win the national championship.
No.
I'll by default I'll say that Ohio State has a talent to win the national championship, so I'll give them and Oregon the nod. But I just think that the quality at the top of the SEC, there's not an elite team, but they're all really damn good. And they've beat up on each other a little bit, and they've all kind of had their stinkers, here and there. Because no one's undefeated at this point in the SEC. But all of those teams are very dangerous if they're on. And like that's one thing about Alabama. If Alabama's on, if their offense is on, like you're gonna have to score 70 points to beat them. And I think that those teams are scary, all of them. And I don't think Miami's a national title contender. I don't think whoever comes out of the Big 12 is a national title contender.
No,
I
I
don't
don't
think Notre
either.
Dame's a national title contender.
Yeah. But look, Alabama is a great example. We said that we were surprised they were in. What do they do with that? Go to LSU, leave no doubt. And so
Yeah.
they got the job done. Let's take a look at some games that are coming up that we think are possible playoff spoilers. So Tennessee at Georgia. Georgia loses this game, they're done. It's totally over. If they win, Tennessee's now another 2-loss SEC team that is now in the mix for this, so that should be interesting. Texas at Arkansas. Arkansas is not very good, so Texas should be able to pull off a win here and just continue to rack up, I don't want to say compiling wins, but I mean, they are, right? They're not giving us anything impressive. Their best win is going to be whoever they play in the SEC title game. And if they end up getting that far. Utah at Colorado. Utah really, really should have beaten BYU. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they should
It's like,
have.
whew, but they didn't. So BYU escapes. Utah now has to play Colorado, who's honestly riding a real high here. That's a game. Colorado wins that. They're in the driver's seat, really. I mean, Colorado BYU should be fascinating as hell in the Big 12 title game if it gets to that. Notre Dame hosts Virginia. Virginia's a okay team in the ACC, but it's a team that they should beat. I think you said you might be at that game, so hopefully have you
I will not
confirmed
be.
that yet?
Nope, I've confirmed I will
Oh,
not be at that game.
I'm sorry, buddy.
Nope, all good.
Budge's favorite Boston College at SMU. They got to travel down there. SMU has looked real good. Now you called them SMPU after their first.
That's it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Against BYU, I think. Was that the first game of the season?
Is that who it was?
I think so.
You may be correct.
I think so. So they've obviously put some things together. Camp Randall, a place that you said was mid at best in terms of atmosphere. Well, Oregon gets to go there. Oregon is, to me, or Ohio State too, to an extent. Oregon hasn't given me all that much to worry about.
They seem unshakable.
They certainly do.
They're the closest thing to a like an elite, like clearly, definitive number one at this point.
What's amazing, Dan Lanning is their coach, right? That's the name?
Yeah.
So they had Bo Nix for a couple years, and they did a lot with Bo Nix. But last year, they just they weren't able to compete with Michael Penix Jr. in Washington because something about it, they just couldn't do it. So what does he do? He goes out and gets Dylan Gabriel, who is kind of, sort of in the Michael Penix line, very explosive. And it took him a few minutes to get started, but man, that's a good football team. And they haven't really offended me with their uniforms this year. So they've actually I love their old school ones where they kind of go old school with the colors. It just looks so good. I wish they'd use those as their primaries, but I get it. But I feel like Dan Lanning is coaching with a chip on his shoulder because he knew he had a good football team last year, couldn't win the biggest games against Washington specifically. And now he's looking at, okay, I've got my guy now. They could be I don't know. I'm sure that they'll prove me wrong, but they're a dangerous, dangerous football team the way that they have been playing. And I think they're one of the most exciting teams. Like if Oregon and Colorado were to play in the semifinal or something like that, cinema, absolute cinema.
Agree, 100%.
Can't friggin' wait, like Bart Scott. Kansas at BYU. Kansas really stinks, so I don't see this being much of a game. So BYU continues to, again, rack up wins, and then Boise travels to San Jose State. Ashton Genty looks the part, hopefully wins the Heisman, but those are the slate of games that I feel like could have an impact. There's probably a couple of other games too. All those teams that are below the 14 line, obviously they're going to have to play, and so those teams are going to jockey for position and move up. So it's not as if we are only talking about these 12 teams, but this certainly at this point is kind of where we are.
Are the Hokies off this week?
Basically. I mean, at this point, they're.
I think they are. I think they're off though, aren't they?
They might be. They lost to Clemson last week, looked absolutely horrible, and couldn't play spoiler. They're going to have to really look at Brent Pry. They're going to have to look at the whole thing in the offseason and like, what are we doing wrong? Because the best thing about this season so far has been the Vic era jerseys, and that's not what I want to be talking about. So look, man, we're both tired. We have had long weeks, long days today, so this isn't our usual fare where we have fanfare. We're going to skip pick of the week this week because, look, you're on a 3-game losing streak. So let's just call it what it is. We'll start fresh next week.
Yes.
But there's a lot of football to watch this week. NFL is driving toward their playoffs. Thanksgiving is coming up. So the holidays will be here before we know it. We'll be into the new year, 2025. Well, we're going to continue to bring the best content that we can. And I want to once again shout out our Pacific Northwest friend. This was a little while ago talking about great stream and content, and we really do appreciate that because we're just two idiots trying to put on sports content for the masses out there, which include your dad, the OG Rick Powell.
Yes.
So,
I'm
uh,
surprised you didn't like have more of a rant about my Notre Dame take, but maybe he's
yeah,
saving
whatever.
that for when I get off.
I was gonna say saving that for right before you want to go to bed, and he's gonna make sure you know
Probably.
every single word of that rant. So, listen, my man, I've had a really good time. Tomorrow night, we're going to do Braves talk. If there's anybody from Bradley Nation who is watching this right now, we hope to see you tomorrow night. We have been, I don't know, we've been having a lot of fun doing Braves talk, and I feel like it's just pushing us toward more and more content, doing great work. Even though we're tired, whenever we get on here, man, it's always great to talk with you, and it certainly lifts me up. That's for sure. So, anything else before we get out of here for
Uh,
everybody?
I completely agree, man. It's definitely a nice little pick me up, especially midweek, like we're doing it. It's nice, it kind of rejuvenates me a little bit to finish the week strong, going into football weekend, especially. And there's a little Bradley game on Saturday at home, so there's a lot going on this weekend, which will be fun. Obviously, man, hoping everything's going well for you up there. I know you've had your hands full, so always thinking about you. And I just know it's tough what you're dealing with. So it's awesome that you're even here in the first place doing this with everything you have going on. But I imagine it's probably a pleasant distraction, and I'm really glad we get to do it.
It is 2024, 25 is amazing where you can take podcasting and live streaming on the road with you. So if you're watching right now, subscribe if you haven't already, like all that good stuff. If you want to call and give us your takes, it's at the bottom of the screen. But for those who are listening later on, 703-718-6314 is the number to do so. You can follow us on TikTok. You can follow us just about everywhere, man. We've hoarded ourselves out to the point that we are everywhere, giving our shitty takes to anyone who will listen. If you're listening in Apple and Spotify, all that good stuff, subscribe, rate, review, give us some stars. As Bomani Jones would say, if you give us 4 stars, I'm inclined to say you are a hater. From me, from Coach, I hope this finds everybody well and safe. We'll see you down the road. This is Football Frenzy.